My microphone has been turned on, which means that I can now say loud things to you. I would like everybody to come in, because we're about to start the session. And we're already 5 minutes late, which for a German is almost physically unbearable. So, please do move in, do get seated. Michael, you particularly. And Antje, hi there. And goodness, the whole mafia is here. Right. Is this, let me ask the conference organizers, this looks a little empty still. So I'm going to give people 2 or 3 more minutes to get seated, but to get seated quickly, if at all humanly possible, so we can get started. And there is a lot of room here in the front. I always like to see nice, good-looking men in uniform sitting in the front. It gives me something to look at. Which is not to be rude to my panelists at all. Yeah, they also give me something to look at.
We still have time to get the uniform.
Thank you. Good. All right. Okay, I think I am going to start now. And for everybody else who's still coming in, please sit down quietly and don't make too much noise. My name is Constanze Stelzenmüller. I'm a senior transatlantic fellow with the German Marshall Fund in their Berlin office, and I am German, yes. And I've been asked to moderate by my friends from the Riga conference what I think is actually the most fascinating and exciting panel of this conference, because I think as the evolving Ukraine conflict has showed, it has become, a lot of the facts by now are blindingly clear. And one has to say that our Russian friends have contributed a great deal to that clarity, so it's sort of difficult these days to have a dispute about who's doing what to whom. And it's always easy, of course, for all of us to say what we are against. It is much more difficult in conflicts like these to say what we are for, and this panel will be discussing what we are for, namely what we want to happen in Ukraine. How can we secure Ukraine's emerging European democracy? That strikes me as one of the least clear questions today, one where there are many diverging views, and one which I think is at great risk of retreating from sight as the conflict takes up all of our attention, as crisis management and conflict management and mediation takes a lot of our attention, and maybe ahead of an impending humanitarian crisis in the winter, when the weather gets cold, which will be very soon. And so I invite us all to take this topic very, very seriously, because without democratic transformation of Ukraine, there will be no good end to this conflict, I think. And with that, I'm going to introduce my speakers. My speakers are Mr. Borys Tarasyuk, to my right, a member of the Ukrainian parliament, which, to say that, only very insufficiently describes his importance in Ukrainian politics. He, I think, needs no further explanation, but of course he is a key player in Ukraine's democratic transformation. Next to him is Oleg Shamshur. Oleg Shamshur is a German Marshall Fund fellow, former Ukrainian ambassador to the United States, and a former head of the EU department in his foreign ministry and deputy foreign minister. Finally, Andrei Ilarionov, a senior fellow at the Cato Institute. But as his name says, and as many of you know, he's Russian. He was, in fact, a senior advisor on economics to Vladimir Putin, but that's a while ago. He was also a G8 Sherpa, and the founder then of the Institute for Economic Analysis. And the Cato website describes you as a forceful and articulate advocate of an open society and democratic capitalism in Russia. Finally, Matt Rajansky, he's director of the Kennan Center at the Wilson Institute for International Studies, formerly of the Carnegie, the Carnegie, what is it called? Institution? Endowment, thank you. I always miss out on that one. The Carnegie Endowment, deputy head of their Russia program, founder of their Ukraine program, and involved in many high-level US-Russian initiatives on security. And finally, my colleague Jörg Vobrich of the German Marshall Fund in Berlin as well, a transatlantic fellow for Central and Eastern Europe, and director of the Fund for Belarus Democracy. He's published widely on democracy and civil society and Central Eastern European affairs. But before we start discussing, the organizers of the Riga conference would like you to see a very brief video that comes directly to us from the Yalta conference. And if I could ask you to start showing the video, that would be great. Well, thank you very much. I think that video was very useful to remind us how the facts on the ground in Ukraine and in Europe and in Russia have been changing over the last 6 months, in some cases turning around 180 degrees, sometimes to the advantage of one side, sometimes to the advantage of the other. I think it's a useful reminder that predictions can be worthless very quickly, and that none of us have cause to be smug about where this is going. Neither side, I think, has cause to be smug, and therefore it behooves us to be careful in the way we analyze what we think we're seeing happening, careful with our arguments, and to be responsible and forceful in the way that we carry them through. As a German, I would add that Ukraine, for me, is the most important conflict in Europe since the breakup of Yugoslavia, and one that, unlike events in Moldova, Georgia, and Belarus, has the chance of being not just a tipping point for Ukraine, but a tipping point for the future of the Eastern neighborhood, a tipping point for Russia, and possibly for the future of the European project itself. So while we are talking about Ukraine here, let us not forget that indirectly we are also talking about our own future in as much as we are not from Ukraine. So it behooves us all to pay attention to these issues. With that, I'm going to turn to my first speaker, and I've asked all of our speakers to speak for no more than 5 minutes at the outset, then we'll have a little back and forth, and I will look very severe if they speak any longer. And then we'll have a little bit of back and forth argument here on the podium, and then we will turn to you, the audience, with questions. I think you by now know also that you can send me questions by Twitter, and I will see them here, perhaps, and then pick you up on those. Okay, with that, Mr. Tarasyuk, you as a Ukrainian politician, greatly experienced in upheavals in Ukraine, how can we secure Ukraine's emerging European democracy? What can, and I think of the greatest concern is for many of us, I think we have other people on this panel who can tell us what they think Europe and America should do and Russia should do. But I think of key concern to all of us is what can you and must Ukraine itself do to secure democracy on its country and to secure its Euro-Atlantic future? And welcome on the panel.
Thank you. Well, first of all, Ukrainian authorities has to do what it was instructed to do in Euromaidan. You know that the Revolution of Dignity was the result of criminal activity of Ukrainian authority led by Viktor Yanukovych, and it emerged as a protest against the decision of the authorities not to sign association agreement with the European Union. So very easily we can refer to this revolution as a revolution for the European values and European future for Ukraine. So to answer the question you just posed, we have to speak about the reason for the problem we have faced immediately after the victory of the revolution. So Russian aggression. So this is a simple definition. What to do? Well, we have no other choice but to fight aggressor. That's what we are doing. Of course, this is not the only option, and Ukraine is facing serious problems in fighting the third largest military power and nuclear power in the world. So we literally are in the forefront of defense of democracy in the whole European continent without any adequate assistance. In this regard, I would like to say that we are not only thinking about how to defend our territory, our sovereignty, we are thinking about non-military solutions. And let me remind you that one of those non-military solutions was in June in Geneva, when Ukraine, Russia, United States and the European Union got together and approved a Geneva statement, which was not implemented by Russia. A recent example of our decision, of our determination to seek for non-military solution was a Minsk meeting, which resulted in protocol between Ukraine, Russia, and in the presence of OSCE and separatists. Unfortunately, a week has passed, and we have numerous violations of this protocol by Russia and pro-Russian terrorists. For just yesterday, 40 examples of violation of this Minsk protocol. So, to finish with, Ukraine is determined to defend our land. Ukraine is ready to find and seek for non-military solutions. Ukraine is ready to provide decentralization for the local authorities, including in Donbass area. But for this, we have to have a cooperation of the aggressor. So we cannot, force aggressor to sit at the table and to agree on something and to stick to our agreements. So this is the greatest problem. So Ukraine alone cannot, resolve these problems, despite of efforts I referred to.
Okay. Fair enough. I think that that's a very important point. I'm sure we will get back to that, including in our discussion with the audience. Ukraine is a country at war. Ukraine is a country at war with a power with nuclear weapons, and a power that is currently not showing any signs of being willing to compromise and to seek a viable peace. All the same, do you think then? Let me just dig at one question here. Is it then impossible for Ukraine to, at the same time, look at the reform of its economy, of its political institutions, and other things that normally are peacetime tasks? Do you think that it will be necessary for Ukraine to remain in a crisis mode and in a war mode, and leave these other tasks aside?
This was the question which the participants of another conference, Yalta European Strategy Conference, which is taking place yesterday and today in Kyiv. And there was also such a question, whether it is possible for Ukraine to defend our land and at the same time to pursue deep and comprehensive economic, and not only economic reforms the country is before it. So I would like to say that the conference I referred to, the Yalta conference, for the first time after 11 years, it is being held not in Yalta, but in Kyiv, because of the understandable reasons. So, and I hope that Riga conference will remain for centuries in the same place. Reforms, this is something which the country is desperately in need. And that's what we, the representatives of democratic forces, were having in mind during the revolution and immediately after the revolution. But Putin, crossed out our attention, our expectations, and our plans. So, in fact, we cannot do reforms together with mobilizing the whole country, its financial and military capabilities to defend the country. It is very difficult to do, and even more because in the parliament we still have those representatives of political forces who, led by Party of Regions and Yanukovych, leading the country in the opposite way. So that's why we are looking forward. We are going to have early parliamentary elections October 26th. And I do believe that after and as a result of these parliamentary elections, we will have obviously more than constitutional majority of democratic forces present in the parliament. And I don't expect, according to the public opinion polls, that the Party of Regions and the Yanukovych guards and the communists will ever appear in the parliament. So as soon as we have a democratic majority, constitutional majority in the parliament, it will be easier for the government, the president and the parliament to pursue economic reform. But what we need peace.
Right. Fair point. Let me move to Oleg Shamshur. And Oleg, I'm going to throw at you what I think is the most difficult question about Ukrainian democratic transformation. And that is, how do you manage a European transformation, which is clearly wanted by a majority of Ukrainians, in a country where also apparently a majority of people feel a deep cultural, historical, economic, and in some ways, in some senses, at least in the eastern parts, even political affinity with Russia and Russian culture. How do you create a European democratic Ukraine that also respects the rights of those who want good relations with Russia when you are at the same time at war with Russia? I don't have an answer to that. I know it's the most difficult question, but if we could try and take a stab at that, if you could help us, that would be great.
Thank you. For the warm-up, let me pick up on what Borys said. Well, actually, I would slightly disagree with him in saying that, well, the development of the war effort of Ukraine has driven many contradictions in the Ukrainian society to the utmost. It showed again, if we want to fight back more efficiently, we should start reforming even under those very difficult circumstances. It's absolutely clear, and I can define the areas where we can, and we should start that. And it would definitely have a direct impact on the efficiency of the war effort. That is fighting corruption, better governance, energy reform, and to revive economy. Now I think we should unleash the possibility of the small and medium-sized enterprises. And definitely, coming back to your question and also to the first question, I think that the way the reforms would be developing in Ukraine would depend on the outcome or at least developments of our war with Russia. And here is really important. And my view is that we are not dealing with a durable ceasefire, it's a pause. And if Putin decides to act after the pause, I'm quite sure he will, then there is also a possibility of for example, martial law or elements of martial law being established in Ukraine, and it would definitely impact the process of reforming the country. Secondly, if we allow Putin to impose even a part of his plan of the settlement, and actually it involves definitely a creation of quasi-Transnistria situation, which he would be trying to play as hepsichords. It would complicate the electoral process because people in those special districts, as is termed in the ceasefire, would be in the parliament, and they would affect definitely the process. And secondly, we should be also thinking about the regime they already established in the areas they control, which is, if I may use, the fascistoid regime with no respect for human rights and values as we know them. And even in the best case, if we stop Mr. Putin, definitely I think we should be ready, Ukraine should be ready for 25, 30 years living with the imminent threat of the Russian aggression. And it would need to make the adjustment to the economic development, to political to some extent political institutions as well, and it would have to lead to the change in the minds of the people. Coming back to your question, that's actually, I see absolutely no contradiction. First of all, at some stage I was deputy head of the State Committee for Nationalities and Migration. So I think that we have excellent, very good European standards and legislation dealing with the rights of minorities, persons belonging to minorities in Ukraine. And until very recently, there has been no complaint exactly. There have been no complaint exactly because the situation was very stable and those rights were ensured. The problem is that since 2004, some politicians in Ukraine decided to play this card. And secondly, when Mr. Putin made the decision to invade Ukraine, at some stage, at least since 2005, Kremlin propaganda started to infuse these so-called problems into Ukrainian dialogue. But what we see now, actually, and that may be the answer to your question, we see growing cohesiveness of Ukrainian society. If you look at Maidan, you would have seen people representing actually all areas of Ukraine, all regions of Ukraine, not only Western Ukraine, as it was claimed by someone. And if you were in the midst of protesters, you would see quite a lot of people speaking Russian. And when now people fighting as volunteers in the East, over there you will see, especially in volunteer battalions, more Russian or Russian-speaking people than even speaking Ukrainian, meaning that cohesiveness of the society is definitely growing, and more people are seeing their future in unified Ukraine. Okay. And finally, a very good example is Mariupol. So watch very carefully what is happening around this city militarily, but what is even more important, what is happening inside the city. And the city also went through the period of trouble. But now, irrespective of their ethnic origin, their ties to Russia, whatever, people are determined to fight for freedom, to fight for the future of Ukraine in Europe.
Okay, then let me ask you a follow-on question, Oleg. And it's very simply, why are so many more Ukrainians fleeing to Russia than they're fleeing within Ukraine? I know that some of them are being resettled to Siberia and are appalled at the conditions they find there, etc. But the UNHCR, which is a reputable international organization under the aegis of the UN, says 850,000 Ukrainians have fled to Russia. Is it only Russian promises, or is there something else that's happening there?
I would say that firstly, still we are all dealing with statistics. It's never accurate. So I would argue that at least as many people are migrating within Ukraine to Eastern Ukraine, to Western Ukraine, to Central Ukraine, and to Kiev, firstly. Secondly, why people are fleeing to Russia? Well, actually, we are dealing with the borderland, and sometimes it's easier to go there. Many people have relatives in Russia. Many people, those who move to Russia, are influenced by the Russian propaganda. They expect that they would be embraced by the Russian authorities immediately, and they would hope for the better life. It happens as well. That's also motivation. But mostly, I think it's really not one-sided. It's not that, I would say, black is multicolored. And actually, I think a very important factor is the proximity of the border.
Okay. Let me move on to Andrei Larionov. Mr. Larionov, what's the bigger catastrophe for Russia and Vladimir Putin, do you think? A Ukraine that transforms successfully, or a Ukraine that fails to transform and becomes a festering disaster?
All right, let's talk about the catastrophe in Ukraine, and after that, let's move to catastrophe in Russia. First of all, I'm a little bit uneasy with the title of our session. Just let's look on this. How to secure Ukraine's emerging European democracy. The words European democracy imply that they could be Asian democracies, African democracies, Australian democracies, Antarctic democracies, and so on. Just I do not understand quite well what does it mean. I do understand a little bit about liberal democracy versus non-liberal democracy. Mr. Surkov told us about the sovereign democracy. At least we have some understanding what does it mean in Russia. But I don't think that the regional approach is correct one. Another one, Ukraine's emerging democracy. Ukraine is democracy for 23 years. It's rather hard to call it emerging democracy. And Ukraine is much more democratic country than Russia for all these years, than Belarus, than Azerbaijan, and many other countries. So that is why I don't understand what we're talking about, the emerging democracy in Ukraine. It's very well established. It's not perfect, as no democracy is perfect, but it's pretty established democracies already. And another one is how to secure democracy. I think the question is really most important, how to secure at this moment, not only and not so much democracy, but freedom of Ukraine, sovereignty of Ukraine, territorial integrity of Ukraine. And I think we need to concentrate on those issues. This title of this session, as well as this little presentation from the Yalta conference, shows how much fantasies and how much misconceptions are flying around, and how little we do understand what's going on in Ukraine, in Russia, in the relations, and in the aggression. Even many people prefer call this so-called Ukrainian crisis or crisis in Ukraine, which is exactly playing in the hands of the Putin's propaganda, because there is no crisis in Ukraine, there is no Ukrainian crisis. This is a Russian-Ukrainian war, to be precisely Mr. Putin's war against Ukraine, and that should be called like this. Each time that anybody is using the phrase crisis in Ukraine, it's exactly placed in the hands of Mr. Putin. Everybody should understand it very clearly. Now, how to to defend Ukraine from this aggression? That is, we started to discuss it yesterday night. That has been in preparation for at least 11 years, at least to my recollection. So maybe I was not in the planning committee for this aggression, but I just happened to know about that. So that is why it was an attempt to have this aggression against Ukraine in late year 2004, early year 2005 during Orange Revolution. After that, during the presidential election in year 2010, when there was some kind of competition between Yanukovych and Tymoshenko. In the case of Tymoshenko, would win few percentage points. There would be occupation of Crimea in year 2010. So it has been postponed several times. The detailed plan of the military campaign against Ukraine, prepared by the Russian General Staff, has been published in April year 2008. In the Ruski Journal, everybody is welcome to read, with explanation of all these brigades, divisions, paratroopers moving to Crimea, to eastern Ukraine, to central Ukraine, and using the nuclear strike against Ukrainian troops southeast of Kiev. So it has been, once again, it has been published more than 6 years ago in open mass media that you can consult. So that is why all this statement about, oh, it's a very big surprise. Mr. Putin did know in February what he would do with Crimea a few days later. It's a kind of leave it for Mr. Putin's propaganda. It's not a reality. It's, once again, let's go back to reality. It's a preparation for at least 11 years. It's a very long plan. So because it's a long plan, because it's a very detailed plan, because it's a very well-prepared war, so this war cannot be stopped, and Ukraine cannot win with its allies and friends, cannot win this war if there would be no, at least, adequate preparations against the aggressor. I don't think that we need to wait for another 11 years to to protect and defend Ukraine, but at least we should be at least serious enough to deal with this threat. And to serious enough, we have several fronts. First of all, internal front in Ukraine, and the huge work for economic reforms, and even more serious reform for military and security area. Actually, during these 7 years war, open part of the war that started on February 20th, actually a couple of days before Yanukovych signed this agreement with opposition and 4 days before he left Ukraine. So it's the Russian Minister of Defense coined the medal for return of Crimea that mentioned the beginning of military stage of this operation, February 20th. So that is why it has nothing common with Maidan, with Yanukovych, with anything else. It's a long plan of the Russian General Staff. So what should be done? Still, there is no total mobilization for Ukrainian forces. There is no closed border. There is still no closed airspace. There is no the full-scale military preparations for dealing with the clear military threat in the east, in the south of Ukraine, on the Ukrainian side. There is still this the so-called humanitarian convoy with trucks that are coming into Ukraine, bringing nobody knows what, taking out of Ukraine nobody knows what, and so on. It's a some kind of game.
So can I interrupt you there? Are you suggesting that the main focus should be on Ukraine's military strength?
Right. It's I'm saying that it's a big work should be done by the Ukrainian side. On the other hand, something should be done. Actually, not something. A lot should be done by the West, by the friends and allies and colleagues in the West, because now there is only one instrument is being under discussion: sanctions. But if we look into these so-called sanctions, it's not even the sanctions; it's jokes. It's too little, too late, too selective. It's not serious. And actually, almost each time which all these so-called sanctions are being implemented or announced, the Russian stock market surges, and the ruble is appreciating versus US dollar. If the so-called sanctions leads to Russian stock market to appreciate, the Russian ruble is to appreciate, seems to me we're dealing not with sanctions, but with some kind of the presence to Russia or to Mr. Putin from the West. No, it's a very serious stuff. But sanctions, even serious sanctions, like, for example, freezing of foreign exchange assets of the Russian government, which never been even discussed, even never been ever mentioned by any Western leader, not even been implemented. But if this decision would be taken, let's say, in late February or early March, year 2014, probably we would not have even Crimea occupation, not talking about Eastern Ukraine. And that's not something that the United States or European Union never did. After the conquering, the capturing of the US embassy in Tehran, US did it. Even in that case, it was not a guarantee for success, but at least it would be very serious sign and very serious action. But it's not even been discussed once again. And there are many other instruments, actually, in the arsenal of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and in diplomacy and in the defense and security issues. None of them have been discussed. Moreover, Mr. Obama has said almost immediately, the United States is not going to use military means. By saying that, President Obama has invited Mr. Putin to perform occupation and annexation of Crimea. Each time when Western leaders are saying that there is no military instrument, there is no military response, there is no military means to that, it's more and more invitation for military means from the Russian side. It's very clear, and Mr. Putin understands it quite well. He's a very smart person, he's very calculated, and each time he understands, okay, if the West is not going to use military...
Can I stop you there?
Means, let me finish on just this. I have many points, but I would mention one important right now here. We have heard all the time, actually this is the first also of this line, is Mr. Putin himself in conversation with many Western leaders. There is no military solution to the crisis in Ukraine, quotation. And many Western leaders repeated Mr. Putin's remark, not attributing who is the author of this line. My point is quite different. There is no non-military solution to the Russian-Ukrainian war.
Okay, well that is clarity.
All right.
All right,
Was I clear enough?
All right. Yes, absolutely. Thank you. I mean, we sort of meandered along up to it, but then you produced tremendous clarity. Okay. It wasn't clear to me that we were going to have a panel here that was going to talk about military solutions mostly. That's a little worrisome. I mean, it may be an accurate depiction of reality, and I do, maybe it's my Germanness, I do keep hoping that there are other things we can do as well. And with that, I'm going to turn to Matt Rojansky and to Jörg. You are obviously here as representatives both of Europe and America, and of people who have experience with, in both cases, with attempts to bridge cultural and political gaps. Matt, you've been a part of, as I said earlier, high-level conversations trying to bridge Russian-American gaps. Were those all vain? Were they all pointless? Were you utterly mistaken about Russian intentions?
Well, first what I ought to say is that the video that we watched gave me two impressions. One, we are apparently rock stars, just based on the emotional content of that video. Second, we're idiots because we're always wrong, everything we say as analysts. And then I guess third is, I'm looking at these flowers and I'm not sure if maybe my role here is to make some big announcement or get married or something like that. And I can assure you that the one thing I know I definitely am not is a representative of official Washington. All I can do is speak for myself and kind of observe what I see. And, you know, I'd like to respond a little bit to the idea that almost every tough truth that seems to be acknowledged by Western leaders devolves very quickly into condemnation that we're simply playing Putin's fiddle. If we say something like there isn't a military solution, well, then we're simply playing into Putin's hands. If we say something like the United States does not intend to send troops, well, we're handing Putin an invitation to invade and occupy Central Europe. This is really problematic. This is not something I think it's productive. And this, I hope, goes to your question, Constanza, that, you know, jumping into a framework which is defined by either you are at war with a country that by any measure you cannot afford to be at war with. And I speak as someone who lives in a country that can afford an awful lot of things and has wasted an awful lot of resources. One thing I'm certain we can't afford is to be dragged small step by small step by small step into a continental or a global confrontation with Russia. Now, does the other side necessarily mean that we give Mr. Putin a free hand? Can we allow Mr. Putin to define a framework in which he automatically gets to dictate what happens in terms of federalism in southeastern Ukraine? Does he dictate that Ukraine's democracy, whether it's emerged or emerging or transitional, has to fail? Obviously not. I think the American interest here, and again, this is my observation, not a statement of policy, is that the United States views Ukraine as important, but more than anything, because it is a measure of the success of the European project, the transatlantic, Euro-Atlantic, and ultimately Euro-Atlantic and Eurasian, and here I speak intentionally in kind of OSCE terms, desire to have a stable, functional space. Now, Mr. Putin, there is no question, and Russia's actions recently represent the biggest threat that we have seen in a very long time to that space. But it doesn't necessarily mean that that threat has to be responded to in this binary framework. So let me try to describe the three things I see the United States doing, why I think the United States is doing them, but at the same time, what I think the limitations of those things are. And again, I hope I'm simply delivering facts here, because I think realistically that's all I can do. First, the American position is to support Ukrainian sovereignty and Ukrainian territorial integrity. Why are we doing that? Obvious, right? It's a precedent issue. If we allow little bits of Ukraine to be carved off, if we allow the map to be changed, then there is no stable basic order in Europe, and that has implications for the global economy of which we are very much a part. That, more than anything else, is important. It's not an American obsessive love of Crimea or Donbass. I can tell you most American officials actually don't really know where those places are, maybe until the last couple of months. Here's the giant caveat on that. We cannot be more Ukrainian than the Ukrainians. At the end of the day, I think we have to recognize the reality that at some point there will be an accommodation, and that accommodation actually will not be forced upon the Ukrainians by outsiders. It will be recognized from the Ukrainian side that it is in their interest at some point to figure out how to deal with a new, completely unpleasant and morally unacceptable reality, but one which has been forced upon them by an extremely powerful external actor. When that happens, it presents a serious policy challenge for the United States and the West, and that is we've set a precedent, we've drawn a line in the sand about a principle in international relations, and we then, as the guarantors of that principle implicitly, will need to step back in order, as a practical matter, as an informal matter, as a political matter, to support our friend, to support the Ukrainians in what we hope will be a workable compromise that will allow them to move forward on precisely the issues of reform and democratic development. That's a serious policy conundrum, but that's where our policy takes us. Number two, we oppose Russian aggression. We've done that through sanctions, through diplomatic isolation, through condemnation, and then possibly through some variety of non-lethal assistance, and that may grow creepingly. Here's the problem, and I think we saw this illustrated quite well at the recent NATO summit and in the declarations of our president, Mr. Obama, just north of here in Tallinn last week. And that is that we have made very clear that we will stop aggression against countries in Europe that cannot alone defend themselves against powerful aggressors. But we said we would stop aggression against NATO countries. We said that Tallinn, Riga, and Vilnius are the same as Berlin, Paris, or London. I think that's as clear as the United States can make a position. But there's one thing that's equally implicitly clear from that statement, is that none of those six are the same as Kiev. And I think that the limitation, therefore, of the American commitment to block aggression, whether it's Russians or anyone else's, in Europe, is the limitation of NATO membership. So we have, to speak of this black and white framework, this zero-sum framework, we have accepted a red line. That is the conundrum of that second policy position. And the third policy position is that we support reform in Ukraine. Right? We support Ukraine's democracy, we support Ukraine's European choice. That's come in the form of financial assistance, which, by the way, has been considerable and I think will continue to be considerable. Technical assistance, support for Ukraine's EU association pathway. But here's the gigantic caveat and the limitation of that policy. We are not patient. Our political process is not patient, and our resources are not unlimited. And I think if we see give it a year, give it 18 months, but that's a maximum outside. If we see a continuity of the Ukrainian path towards waffling, towards treating everything as an informal question, which the details are to be negotiated up to the very last minute. In other words, behavior very similar in the sphere of reform and democracy building and markets and so on to what we saw from Mr. Yanukovych. But by the way, what we saw from many previous Ukrainian leaders. If that continues, then the resolve, the moral empathy, the commitment that now exists from official Washington, I think will dissipate very quickly, and there is no shortage of international crises and international interests for the United States that can distract our attention. That's my view of where we're coming from now.
Thank you, Matthew. I think that was a very useful exposition of the conundrums as seen from the West. And I think much of that is shared in Europe, actually. The question, indeed, and you point to one important difference, I think, between Europe and the US, which, if you live in Berlin, feels slightly different, of course, which is that the US's scope and imagination and sense of responsibility is a global one, and its attention is very short. It's different when you live on the same continent. We know, as Europeans, and indeed as Germans, as the neighbors of Poland and of the Baltics, that what happens in Ukraine and what happens in Russia, and between the two of them, is of existential importance for us and for our future, and for the future of the European project. That is, I think, the source of many of the disagreements, perhaps in detail and less in strategy, between Europe and America. And with that, I turn to Jörg. Jörg, you have a great deal of experience watching and participating in, analyzing the democratic reforms in Eastern Europe. You've lived through some of them in Eastern European countries. And as you watch this situation where you have some of the representatives of Ukraine and Russia saying there is only a military solution to this, there is no non-military solution, and framing, or like Mr. Tarasyuk saying, we have to deal with the conflict first and then we can talk about reform. What's your outlook? What's your outlook for democratic transformation in Ukraine, and what can we expect reasonably, and what can the West, what can Europe, and indeed Germany do to help?
Well, in the first place, I would say it's almost impossible to provide an outlook. I think if we remember 1989 in our own countries, whether that was East Germany, my own native country, or any of the countries further east, and none of us knew what was coming. I think we had ideas, we had hopes, but we didn't necessarily know how things were gonna pan out. So I think providing that sort of outlook is, I think, impossible and would be almost irresponsible if we did that. Now, obviously, I think Ukraine and any other country in the region that are embarking on reform processes today have to some extent the benefit of the experience of their Western neighbors. And I do think that this is where both the Ukrainians and ourselves as Western partners should look when it comes to devising measures for supporting the Ukrainian reform process. I think we have a wealth of experience there. We don't need to reinvent the wheel in many ways. So this is certainly something that today we have as an advantage over 25 years ago. From the experience that I have myself, and also the primary occupation that I have today, that is work with civil society in Central and Eastern Europe, I would say that this is an aspect and an angle that's often overlooked. I mean, also in the discussions here, we talk about sort of government level, state institutional level approaches, solutions, policies, and interaction. But I think more often than not, we do lose sight of the sort of societal angle and the civil society aspect of it, which, as we know, was so important in the Ukrainian crisis. I mean, it was civil society that was at the origin of the protests. I think it also is an agent or an actor that will pay very close attention to what government is doing in Ukraine, since they have seen how things can go wrong after the Orange Revolution when they don't pay enough attention to it. So I think that the government in Kiev today, and the one to be formed in a couple of weeks, will certainly be aware of that watchdog. But let me add another 2 or 3 short points here from that exactly societal angle, because I think this is also, there are a couple of points that we overlooked a little here at the conference so far. One is certainly the aspect of the humanitarian crisis that we're likely looking at in the next couple of months. I think this is, interestingly enough, also an area where there can be and should be some cooperation with Russia. I mean, this actually is a level that affects the Russian Federation as much as Ukraine and potentially its Western neighbors, where none of the sides involved have sufficient resources to immediately step in to alleviate that likely crisis. So I think that this is an area that we can safely look at as a potential area for cooperation, if only to provide some short-term help to the people who need it most. A second aspect that I find interesting in the course of this crisis is how the sort of momentum of solidarity has evolved in Europe for Ukraine. If we're looking at opinion polls in our own countries, then we see that a very sizable majority of people across Europe clearly takes the side of Ukraine here and is ready to support Ukraine politically, economically, even going as far as majorities today in our societies suggesting and supporting EU membership for Ukraine. I think this is an important aspect for our own political players because it defies to some extent the restraint that our own governments have shown over the last 20 years when it comes to providing some form of European perspective to the Eastern neighborhood. And I think that's, that lack of a perspective that we are also responsible for is part of the problem that we're looking at today. My final point, and that's partly also in response to what's been said before, is I think we should give some credit to the Ukrainian government. They have not lost sight of the reform process, despite the fact that there is a war going on in their country that could potentially, or in most, I mean, we would all expect this to draw all the attention of political players. They have pushed through a number of reforms. And that's remarkable. They have not been completely absorbed by that military conflict, but they have started to push through a number of reforms that certainly are crucial. I just wanted to point this out because, especially what Tarasyuk said earlier on, sounded more like, okay, this completely takes our attention away from the reform process that has to happen one way or another in Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you, Jörg. That's a useful reminder. And thank you also for that unofficial little commercial for the survey which GMF runs, Transatlantic Trends, in which I happen to direct. I thought for those of you who haven't seen it, Jörg was indirectly referencing a question which may be of interest. We asked whether people in Europe and in America, respondents, were willing to support continued political and economic assistance to Ukraine, even if that meant a risk of increasing conflict with Russia. And we had 57% in the US and 58% of respondents in the EU who agreed with this statement. Of course, we asked the same question in Russia. And in Russia, you have an even larger majority saying we're willing to support continued influence, Russian influence in Ukraine, even at the risk of increasing conflict with Europe. So there you have it. I think we will stop here with the conversation on the panel, since I'm conscious of the passage of time. We have another half hour. I've got a question here, and I see Andrew Scher, and I see Vlad Sokor, and I see lots of people. Okay, and Konstantin. All right, Andrew Scher first. James Scher, I'm sorry, I knew I was mixing up names. Sorry, James. Do you need a mic? Yes, you do.
Have interpreters, they need one.
James Scher, Chatham House. Yes. Everybody else, introduce yourselves, please.
Thank you. It's been argued not only by me that President Putin's objective is now to create a new Transnistria, or possibly two Transnistrias, in eastern Ukraine, with a view to rendering the rest of Ukraine dysfunctional and unsustainable. But others in the West have argued very persuasively that the separation of Donbass, Luhansk, from Ukraine will create the conditions that will allow Ukraine, the rest of Ukraine, most of Ukraine, to successfully move west. I would be grateful if the panel would provide their assessment of the implications of a frozen conflict in eastern Ukraine.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to take 2 or 3 more. Vlad, go ahead. Can we have the microphone up here? And then I'm going to go back there.
Thank you, Constanze. Vladimir Sokor, Jamestown Foundation. I would like to hear the panel's views on 3 topics that were not mentioned during the first round of presentations. The first would be, how do you assess the function of Mr. Putin's Novorossiya project as a means of rendering Ukraine dysfunctional and potentially dismembering the state? The Novorossiya project remains at the top of the Kremlin's official rhetoric. My second question, how would the panel regard the issue of political representation of the occupied territories in the new political system of Ukraine through the parliamentary elections and subsequently? And my third question, panel's views about Russia's claim to become a participant in the internal constitutional debates in Ukraine, possibly in the role of an international supervisor / guarantor of the post-conflict constitutional order. And in this context, the so-called federalization. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. My impression is that the federalization thing isn't gaining a lot of traction in Europe, but I may be wrong. Back there, please. The lady back there.
Elena Krassilova, University of Kent. Can we please go back to the very beginning and revisit Euromaidan? Because after all, without the ontology, understanding the ontology of Euromaidan, it's very difficult to speak about Ukraine's future. And Euromaidan, I don't think, was simply the result of Yanukovych's bad government. I think there is far more to it. It was also, I think, a response to the clash of the EU and Russia's regional ambitions, basically under their respective regional projects. So, and in this war or ambitions, obviously Ukraine was only an object. So how can we then, obviously in view of the panel, perhaps can reconcile these regional ambitions of Ukraine's larger neighbors? And will the issue of incompatibility of these regional projects ever come off the agenda? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I'll take one more here and then we'll go back to the panel. If you could take the mic up here.
Thank you so much. Giga Bokeria, Georgia, opposition party UNM. I can't refrain from again reacting to this very insulting attitude to Ukrainian people that their choices don't matter, it's others who are making these choices. This is deeply offensive. But my question is to Mr. Rozhansky. You've been a prominent voice throughout the last years of the position that engagement with Russia was the way forward and that it was necessary for stability in Europe, in the world. So I'm repeating kind of a question of the which was already asked. Do you consider that it was basically, that was wrong premise? Because what you said now, there's no Article 5 for Ukraine, it's understandable. The question is there a final conclusion made that Putin is a threat to European security and that US is already in confrontation with Putin? Because you said we don't want to be dragged into confrontation. So you say there is no confrontation now, as we speak? Because if that's the case, then we're all in serious trouble. Thank you.
Let me, before I hand this to the panel, say that regardless of what Western and Russian policies towards Ukraine may have been, I don't think I heard anybody say on this panel that Ukrainians are not agents, they're just objects. I think they were acting as agents, and if anything, they proved their agency in the Euromaidan. But since Matt Rozhansky was the only one who was addressed directly, I'm going to turn to you first and then go through the panel to react to the other questions.
Okay. Thank you, Giga, for the question. Thank you also for giving some very frank commentary when we visited Tbilisi, well, a while ago now. I remember that. I think that this and this conference and the tweets which I've been reading and noting down that, let's see, Matt Rojansky says the U.S. supports Ukrainian sovereignty, opposes Russian aggression, and supports Ukrainian reform. Matt Rojansky gives a scary description of U.S. appeasement policy. That all of these things, I don't know, I see a contradiction in that, maybe you don't. I think all of these things are evidence of the value of dialogue. I mean, simply put, look, for what it's worth, I'm a lawyer by education. That's what we do. We solve problems within the frameworks of dialogue, of rules, of figuring out what the rules mean when they're applied to the messy and difficult reality, which almost always entails parties that don't have equal power. And that's really been the problem. Ironically, by the way, the biggest problem, you asked about US-Russia dialogue, and you did too, Constanza, I attempted to answer, but let me try and be clear. The biggest problem with US-Russia dialogue for the last 25 years, to be quite frank, was unequal power. Was the fact that the United States was a global actor, and Russia had, to a significant degree, ceased to be. In many regions, in many areas, you know, the big exception to that was consistently nuclear. And the problem, therefore, with that dialogue was not that it was pointless to talk to the Russians because you couldn't talk to the Russians. It was actually that the Russians wanted to talk about a whole host of issues where we could not clearly see what they could deliver that would be of interest to us. One of the reasons that I do believe dialogue is important in this case is because I think the other panelists have illustrated this perfectly. Not all, but a large proportion of the key levers to resolving this situation are in fact in Moscow. How you get to those levers isn't strictly binary. In other words, there isn't just the option of war, absolute escalating to the most possible devastating extent, or appeasement and simply hoping they'll decide to do the right thing. In the middle of those two options, there is a mixture of pressure, which we have attempted to apply. And look, I get the criticism that we haven't done everything that we could do, that we haven't done it fast enough, and that we includes both Europe and the United States here. But I think this is what Constanza referenced, by the way, when she was talking about the differences about tactics. It's very easy. By the way, Andrei, you want to talk about sort of playing the Kremlin's game. The best way to play the Kremlin's game is to get into an endless argument about the small tactical questions and miss the big picture. I think the big picture here is, if there is a way, through a combination of credibility, which comes from pressure, right? You don't have credibility if you roll over every single time without doing anything. Credibility and dialogue to figure out how to incentivize the other side to pull some of those levers, then we have to take that path. And I think the argument in the end is, and I don't want to sound too lawyerly here, but before you reach the question of total war, and let's be honest, that a war that involves NATO and Russia in Europe, in any sense, is a total war. We have been lucky, at least on 2 occasions, I'm thinking of Kosovo and I'm thinking of Georgia, that did not occur. That war was limited, in fact, essentially to regional actors. But that type of war, before you reach the question of whether you're even on the road to that, you had better try everything else. And I'm in the camp that tries everything else. And we may fail, but we're in the midst of it now.
Okay, let me go to our 2 Ukrainian panelists to look at some of the questions raised by James Sher and by Vlad Sokor. The question of frozen conflicts in Ukraine, 1 or maybe 2 Transnistrias, or separation of Donbass from the rest of Ukrainian territory. And of course the question of the political representation of the minorities in those territories. Why don't you give that a try?
I will try to answer.
Not minorities, political
of the territories, yeah. The political representation of the territories.
Let me try to answer James's question as soon as he brought this into discussion. So firstly, coming back to what I said, we have already have in the ceasefire agreement a very, I would say, unwelcome and dangerous precedent of creating those minuscule entities. But coming back to, and definitely it will be used to destabilize situation, and it will be played by Putin as Hepsichord, who is raising or lowering tension to his volition. But coming back to your question, it's a very important, to a very great extent, one of the key issues. So actually, apart from what you said concerning the views in Europe, in Ukraine, I also heard some people at the beginning of the conflict, maybe we just do not fight, we leave Donbass and Lugansk as they are. If they want to go to Russia, let them go. But that has changed dramatically. So firstly, after this period of active warfare, there is understanding, even among those who didn't get it at the very beginning, that these areas would be used as the sort of beachhead for further encroachment on Ukraine's territorial integrity. That definitely would be coming. Secondly, there is growing solidarity. As soon as the number of people who are still under the influence of the crazy ideas of Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics is actually going down because people lived under their spell, under their rule of terror, and actually definitely the overwhelming, I would say even the overwhelming majority of the population would like to see the future in unified Ukraine. So there is also growing solidarity. We cannot leave those people behind to those facts. And thirdly, it's also was clear from the very beginning, but somehow it didn't pop up in the discussions too often. There is a very important say element in Crimea and in Donbass situation. Both are close to the areas of the potential carbohydrates deposits, either in the Black Sea or in the east of Ukraine, in Donbass, and especially in Lugansk area. And that's, I think, also a part of the Putin plan, to undercut Ukrainian energy independence and sufficiency as much as possible. It's also being taken into account. So, summing up, the overriding feeling is no way that we leave those areas at the mercy of Mr. Putin and terrorists.
Okay, Mr. Tarasyuk.
Like September 11 proved that not a single person, even the mightiest country in the world, well, can be a subject of terrorism and of victims, innocent victims. So the events in Ukraine, as a result of Russian aggression, resulted that no nation in Europe is free from the repetition of the appearance of so-called green men in any country. So what I would like to say that whatever concessions could be done to Putin, it will not satisfy his appetites. So the Crimea is not enough for him. Donbass is not enough for him. Novorossiya is not enough for him. The whole Ukraine is enough for him. The question mark is what could be the adequate response from the international community? For the time being, I don't see any adequate response. I see the damage of the international order. I see the damage of international system of international law, and the guarantees which have been mentioned here by you, Vladimir. After what Russians have done to Ukraine, I don't believe in guarantees. Because I was one of the author or co-author, together with Strop Talbot and Georgy Mamedov, of Budapest Memorandum on National Security Assurances. We call them guarantees. So, what was done by one of the guarantor state? Not talking about it anymore, but what the United States and United Kingdom has done to implement their commitments as guarantor states? Nothing. So I don't believe in any kind of guarantees. After what Russia have done, nobody can feel, I mean, a country, people can feel themselves safe. And about the political representation in Donbass. So there are two problems in Donbass. about the representation. Local elections, self-governance, and the answer was given by Ukrainian authorities. We are ready to provide them the possibility to vote in the local area to elect their authorities, their local authorities. We are ready for this. But with regard to political representation in the Ukrainian parliament, it cannot be done in the area which is in the state of war. So the majority districts, according to the existing Ukrainian electoral law, so we have half of the parliament on a majority system, half of the parliament in proportional system on the party list. So it is possible that representatives of Donbass could be elected, even those we don't like, can be elected on a party list. So one cannot exclude this. But it is impossible to imagine those representatives be elected in the majority districts, where the authority have no control and cannot organize the elections. So that's why this is the problem. And I see that this problem will be resolved in the following way. Some representatives of Donbass area, even those we don't like, could be elected, theoretically could be elected by a party proportional system, but they cannot be elected on a majority system. Thank you.
Okay. Mr. Larionov, Novorossiya.
What shall we do with the...
No, do you agree with Mr. Tarasyuk that the end of Putin's purpose is, if you will, the return of Ukraine to the embrace of the Eurasian Union by military force or whatever it takes? And is that where it stops?
No, it was quite clear. It's not the end of the game. This Novorossiya and even the whole Ukrainian project, which is not finished, it's only beginning, even bringing Ukraine under Mr. Putin's control is introductory chapter to the so-called Fourth World War, as Kremlin's propaganda people are telling us. So they call Cold War the Third World War, that's finished. Now they call this war that is being waged right now, as they call, against Russia, or Russia is against the Western Security Alliance, as a Fourth World War. And the Ukraine is the only first introductory chapter, after which will be new chapters. And the some kind of strategic purpose of this Fourth World War is to some kind of divide the Western Security Alliance into camps. One is Anglo-Saxon world, US, UK, now Australia, plus frontline states, Poland plus Baltic states. This is one camp that, according to their views, it's impossible to get agreement with, so that this part of Western Alliance should be defeated. And there is another part of Western Security Alliance, which is called Continental Europe, headed by Germany, according to their views. That is a potential, at least neutral part of this alliance, and the best case may be allies of Putin's Russia. Please don't tell that just whether it's right or wrong, but just it's kind of their concept, their vision. So, and they are working hard to get results of this kind of division of this alliance and achieving these results. But using this concept, and this concept is not for 1 month or for 1 year, it's a long concept. So they're very serious about that, they're preparing for that for a long time, and they're some kind of trying to implement this.
But Mr. Larionov, surely that's a delusional notion. I mean,
okay.
I often get that impression when I've just been in Moscow to present our survey at the Carnegie Moscow Center, and I've had that impression in conversation with Russian officials quite often, that they just don't read us correctly. They don't understand what's going on in Germany, and they must not be reading German surveys. Are they incapable of understanding European politics?
No, it's fine. If they don't understand, they don't understand a lot. But should we help them understand better?
Well, I mean, if it saved them from some
No, it's a question mark. So just how they use this new knowledge, just to understand better how to divide the Western alliance. It's okay, it's a question. But another point that Mr. Rozhansky has put forward, very interesting, about we are all for dialogue, actually, at least most in this hall, I hope, for dialogue. Even not everybody is lawyer, so we are even just some people with epaulette, not physical fighting yet, at least in this hall. But there is a little bit difference between Riga conference on security and let's imagine a very dark street in the night, you alone, or maybe with your wife or with your kids, walking around, and you're confronted with gangsters, bandits, thugs, who are demonstrating very clearly their intentions and their desires concerning your property, your kids, your wife, yourself. So what would be your behavior in that regard? Dialogue, some kind of consulting with the criminal code, some kind of recommendation to read Bible, particular chapter, or recommendations not to cross the red line, because in 18 months' time there will be sanctions to the remote relatives of the gangsters. Right? No. It's a very particular situation. So that is why the only way, if you would follow this particular advice that you are giving, seems to me your fate or fate of your close one would be not very good. So that is the only way.
I will try only walking down dark alleys when I have you with me.
Right. Okay. So my recommendation would be, actually, many people who happen to be unfortunately in such a similar situation, is just to fight, to resist, to cry, to use all possible instruments and methods. Certainly call for some kind of neighbors, for police, whatever police will be, whatever, to do everything possible to attract attention and to resist. It's exactly what is called, there is no military solution, because fighting and resistance, it's a military solution to this particular crisis. So that is why it's not our choice. It's not we like fighting. It's not that we some kind of like to some kind of to hit the gangsters. But in some particular circumstances, there is no other solution to this problem, and we need to recognize that. Because without recognition, because probably in the United States or in some particular neighborhood, some people did not meet such, did not happen to be in such situation. In some part of the world, we do have, and some people are being grown up. And some people use the same approach not only in the neighborhood, but also in international relations. I think you should let him do that,
because I still have a lot of people here on the list.
No,
I think he should get a right of response, and then the audience should also get a right of response. I mean, you've made your point very, very forcefully.
Excuse me?
I think you've made your point extremely forcefully. I know
As
you should give that a chance.
for Novorossiya and Transnistria, I think Borys and Oleg have explained very clearly. Certainly, from the purely some kind of abstract point of view, it's possible to, okay, Donbass, okay, Donetsk, Lugansk, okay, we can cut off, we will be better off. We did it, experienced already many times. Many people thought, okay, let's give Abkhazia and South Ossetia, and there will be no problem for Georgia. Did it work? No. Whether we'll give Crimea and everything will be finished? No. Appetite is growing with each feed, with each meal. Now is Eastern Ukraine, and it will continue. So that is why we learned it in the 1930s with two aggressors in Europe. We know the sooner the world will stop aggressor, the better will be for the world. There is no other solution.
Matt,
so I would note two things. One, Andrei, like I said, I'm very glad you live in Washington, so we can walk down dark alleys together.
I do travel a lot in different places as well.
Yes, okay. My second point would be, I think you would have made an excellent lawyer, by the way, because the argument by analogy, I think anybody knows, is a classic lawyerly tactic. Look, the fact of the matter is here, we're dealing with a situation in which the U.S. position, and I hope I've been fair and accurate in describing it, is absolutely, 100% to support Ukraine's right and, in fact, duty to defend itself territorially. But we're reaching now a second question, and that question is, what do outsiders so far to this conflict, war, do about the war? And that is more complicated. I'm not going to wade into the analogy or the metaphor, but I think we understand why it's more complicated, because we have choices. We have made some wrong choices, and we've made some of them too slowly. But at the end of the day, one thing I'm certain of is we can't guarantee that the choice for the West to intervene militarily, you've said there's no non-military solution. Ukraine is losing in a war right now. So you're talking about an intervention militarily. The choice to do that doesn't necessarily end with the robber running out of the alley and the victims surviving. That's my concern, that there is a worse outcome here that we can try to avoid, that we can try to prevent through credible, tough pressure. That's the best that we can do right now, at the same time that we seek, and maybe it's only temporary, maybe it is only temporary, maybe it is, we'll find out.
You know what is a credible policy? George Bush Jr. On August 11th, year 2008, gave an order to use Navy to move to the Black Sea and to use Air Force to move to Romanian and Turkish air bases. And the Russian tank advance on Tbilisi that has been launched in the morning of August 11th has been stopped in 24 hours.
And Andrei,
that
and the United States...
And it was a credible threat that stopped Russian-Georgian war.
And the United States was involved in a naval exercise with the Ukrainians just a week ago, and there's a ceasefire. We can have this argument.
I'm sorry, I'm going to stop this. Sorry, I have more questions from the audience, and I would like to stop you now. Honestly, I have Mr. Tarasyuk who wants to comment, and I have Jörg Forbeck, and I have questions from the audience. Sorry, it doesn't get to be a two-way conversation on this panel. Mr. Tarasyuk and then Jörg.
We in Ukraine, we hear what we hear from major capitals, from Washington, Berlin, Brussels. We hear concern, we hear serious concern, we hear deepest concern, and so on and so forth. We hear that we are not going to send you and to sell you lethal weapons. So it came to to our mind that we are one-on-one with the aggressor. So we have to defend ourselves, not relying to anybody else. And I must tell you that among the Ukrainian society and population, we see, the greatest sense of, national identity. Now the nation is being awakening from apathy, and more Ukrainians are demonstrating that they are Ukrainians. Young people are painting fences everywhere, in cities and villages in blue and yellow, thus demonstrating their, respect to the country in this symbolic way. Many young people are volunteering to serve in the army. They're dying for the country. And they will do this. The whole nation will do this until you will express your concern, serious concern, and deepest concern. Thank you.
Jörg.
Yeah, very briefly, and maybe directly to continue on the note that Borys Tarasyuk just outlined. I know it's little consolation for the Ukrainians, but I do think that the EU has moved more than anybody could have expected in the last 6 months. I do think that there is a pretty rapid learning process going on inside of the EU. I think there are measures in place that you would have been called a madman a year ago if you had mentioned to anybody in the EU that there may be a point in time when sanctions will be imposed to Russia. I understand completely that this is hardly a consolation for you and for those who suffer in the east of Ukraine, but I do think that we need to acknowledge that there is something very significant shifting also inside of the European Union. Vlad, on the federal question, as it were, I think it's very simple. I mean, that was a sort of trick to see whether the Germans would cop onto that. I mean, Germany, a federal country, fairly sizable and important when it comes to decision making. I think that was a Russian move to see how far the Germans would sort of walk into this trap. In the end of the day, the Russians are talking about confederation, and that, as we know, is a completely different concept. Elena, on the ambitions of both sides, I think the problem here is that the EU doesn't have ambitions. There is one side that clearly has them, and that is Russia. The EU doesn't have any ambitions towards those countries. I would even put this more pointedly. The Ukrainians are showing us the ambition that we don't have. I mean, they are demonstrating a resolve here that we should be having, and much the same goes for Georgia and Moldova. So I think that we are in the situation that we're in exactly because the EU side doesn't have the ambition to declare a European perspective, to do everything it can to help those countries. And obviously there's another side that clearly has a stronger ambition.
Thank you. I'm now going to take another round of questions, and I'll start with this lady here. Then Konstantin has been waiting for a time, then I'll go back there.
Nadia Arbatova, Russian Academy of Sciences. I have a question about the military solution of the conflict. Personally, I don't take seriously the Russian journal. There is no shortage of crazy people and extremist publication in Russia nowadays. But if Mr. Larionov takes it seriously, and in particular the threat to use tactical nuclear weapons, how can he support the military solution of the conflict? And shouldn't we ask our Ukrainian colleagues whether they will be in favor of the military solution if there is a risk of a TNW use? Thank you.
Right, thank you for adding another terrifying note. Konstantin first, and then we'll go to the back. Can you hand the microphone over here?
Tactical nuclear.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Konstantin Agats. I have two questions. One to Matt, actually. If you were a chief legal advisor on the Russian, Ukrainian, European, American negotiations, you say there's always something in the middle. So could you formulate your 3-point or 5-point plan that could lead to satisfactory solution in which everyone will walk away with their faces pretty much intact? My question to both Oleg and Borys, about yesterday's news that implementation of the EU association agreement has been postponed. If you read, social networks or even already opinion pages, many claim it was a mistake, probably the first big mistake of President Poroshenko to delay this, because this basically means that what seems to be like a strategic project for Ukraine has now become hostage to domestic politics. How you would explain that? What's your view? How do you deconstruct it?
Okay, I've just been told we have to finish more or less now, so I'm really sorry, I can't take any more questions.
So I was lucky.
That's fine. I've apologized to all of you. I'm sure there will be a lot of material for discussion in the coffee break. It seems to me the room is heated up enough for that. I am going to go backwards. Jörg, start with you and then go in this direction. Make it short and snappy, please.
Well, even though the Ukrainian on the panel were asked that question, Konstantin, I think the delay of the DCFTA may actually be an advantage. It certainly will be a problem for Poroshenko and those who support him in the elections. I think he may well have lost some political capital there. That is clear. But when it comes to the actual DCFTA, Ukraine wasn't ready for it. I think this would have been suicidal in many ways for Ukrainian business, especially in a situation where the economy of Ukraine is so damaged already. So I think that that postponement may provide a chance, if the incoming Ukrainian government is disciplined enough, to better prepare the country for the full implementation of that. I think the important bit to this delay is obviously that Ukraine will keep it, the EU will keep its borders open to production from Ukraine. That's the almost more important piece than the actual delay of the DCFTA, in my understanding.
All right, thank you. Matt?
Yeah, let me just try to respond to Konstantin as directly as I can. I mean, first, I think you have two problems, which is you do not seek to achieve a long-term compromise at a time when you have fighting, at a time when you have the other kind of fighting, which is political fighting. So election season and killing are actually both the death knell of sustainable compromise. When you can get past that, right, so we know this from conflicts in areas before, when you can get a sort of zone of stability for enough time, then I think you can actually get public input, which is the one thing there's been very, very little of, actually, from the Ukrainian government side, certainly from the Russian side, from the Western side. We need to actually figure out where the Ukrainian people, including the people in the southeast, are today. It presents a really serious problem. I don't know that we ever really satisfyingly answered the question of how you engage those people in an election season. I don't know how you really represent them effectively so that they can have people who can participate in the process, who have legitimacy to do so, credibility, and the ability to deliver. If you can do that, though, then I think the broader shape of what the compromise is kind of out there in the ether already. We know that there's going to have to be autonomy. We know that we're going to have to reinvent, post-Budapest, what it means to have a credible assurance or a guarantee of non-intervention on Ukraine's territory. I don't know how we do that, but we know that that's what we need, right? And then the third piece of the package is, what do the Ukrainian people get out of it? Because the big question all along, and this is the competing spaces, what does Europe deliver them? What does the Eurasian Union deliver them, right? It's one thing to offer a big discount on gas. It's another thing to say you get 20 years of hardship, at the end of which you might have a nice job in a German factory. Right? So we have to figure out what these things mean, what the people want, and then we can start to deliver kind of this multi-part plan, I think most of which is out there.
First of all, thank you very much for this wonderful question, Mrs. Arbatova, because it's exactly the essence of this discussion. Because your implied answer to your own question is to offer Ukrainians to surrender. Exactly. Because if the gangster have the nuclear weapons, and he's actually threatening to use this nuclear or whatever, knife or automatic gun or whatever, it means the victim should surrender and would give whatever, property, money, kids, wives, their own life. We actually experienced that, and we know from the history of Europe of the 1930s what is the result of that. We know from the history of the last 6 years with Georgia and Ukraine what is the result of that. So the answer actually is very well known. The only way not to allow Mr. Putin to use this as a threat and even use it is resistance. Is resistance of Ukraine together with all friends and allies. Only solidarity of all world that it will be absolutely not tolerated, which will be supported by very credible actions, not only by Ukrainians, by the West, would not allow him to use neither nuclear weapons nor even threat to use nuclear weapons. And the answer was given by a very famous person after the collapse, after catastrophe in Dunkirk. We shall never surrender. We shall fight on beaches. We shall fight on streets. We shall fight on hills. We shall fight everywhere, but we shall never surrender. That's the only response to aggressor. And the question that Vlad has raised, which is very important, which is related to this, because concerning this kind of involvement or possible involvement of Russia into constitutional process in Ukraine or in any other country, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Georgia, Azerbaijan, poses the question, where is the line, where is the border between the world where nations can choose their fate, they can choose their destiny, they can choose their geopolitical, geoeconomic orientation or whatever, and where cannot do it, and where can follow Mr. Putin's orders? It's a very clear question. So far, we have received the response from Mr. Obama that Tallinn, Riga, Vilnius are in relative security. We do not know what happens with Minsk, Kiev, Chisinau, Tbilisi, Yerevan, Baku, Astana, and many other places. And this is a very serious question because it's a revision of the results of this Cold War. After the Cold War, it was very clear that each nation, including in the post-Soviet space, has a right to choose own destiny, whatever this destiny will be. Now, Mr. Putin is trying to revise this understandable settlement, which actually has been signed by in many documents. And this is actually the question, most of all, to the West, the whole West, whether modern West, today's West, is ready to allow Mr. Putin to behave like a gangster in the dark alley?
Thank you. Oleg.
Well, actually, I would like firstly to pick up what Mr. Lurel said, and basically, of course, I see some room for diplomatic maneuvering, but I'm absolutely sure, and our history showed that unless we fight, unless we defend our freedom, there is no chance we win. But at the same time, I'm totally convinced that there is, for this reason, there's no chance for Putin to win this war. But secondly, we have some history of discussion with Matt, going back to a couple of conferences. But so I would refer to what he said and what I heard here. Many people talk about the possibility of compromise by accommodating Mr. Putin's intentions or ideas or interests. Maybe that's the most correct. But it's quite clear that Putin is not ready to seek any compromise unless it definitely corresponds to his plan for Ukraine, which is taking over Ukraine, this way or the other. And it's totally incompatible with the democratic development of Ukraine. Any talk about reform, if we are talking about this accommodation, are totally incompatible. Because this country, I mean Ukraine, is faced with alternative. Either we try to prop up dilapidated house, to clear, to repair the holes, maybe to color, to wash it, even make some repairs, and it looks presentable, but it's road to nowhere. Or we relaunch this country, reset it in many senses from zero. And that's the basic choice we are facing now. It affects as well as our reform process and definitely our foreign policy choices, because we need new paradigm of relationship with Russia. And for the same token, I'm quite sure that unless West understands that there is a need for a new paradigm of relations with Russia, taking into account the existing reality, that is also the road to the next major crisis.
Mr. Tarasyuk.
Yeah. Nadia raised very serious question about tactical nuclear weapons. Since I was dealing with this issue, not tactical nuclear weapons, but intercontinental ballistic missiles and nuclear weapons in Ukraine, let me remind you that Ukraine agreed to join non-proliferation nuclear treaty in exchange for the guarantees of our national security. So we implemented our commitments, whereas guarantors did not. So this is one reality. A second reality, in Ukrainian parliament, among the politicians and the society at large, there is a growing perception that we need to restore our nuclear capability. This is one of the, stories. I personally do not believe that this can be the realistic approach. But more and more people, even in the parliament, we have a new draft law speaking about the denunciation of our participation in NPT. Second, the policy of appeasement did not work in case of Hitler. Neither the policy of appeasement will work with Putin. So I see, politically, not economically, the delay in implementation of association agreement with the European Union, between Ukraine and European Union, as a sign of appeasement, as though it looks like as though Ukraine and the European Union are trying to appease Putin in this way. Thank you.
Okay, this is where the moderator has to be a little bit of an immoderator. I have to take issue with two things that have been said here. One is the word appeasement. I don't think what the EU and what America are doing is appeasement at all. I think we have reacted extremely strongly and with extraordinary solidarity, and these measures are hurting Putin and his cronies. And we can see that now. We can see it in the development of the ruble, which is the reverse of what you said, and we can see it in the difficulties that Russian companies have in finding refinancing on the international financial markets. That is the kind of game that the West can win, because the one thing that the West must not do, I think, is to use the laws of the gangster. We can fight the gangster, but not according to his rules, but I think we can fight him very successfully using our rules, and I think we'll win that one. On that cheerful note, thank you for being a very attentive audience, and thank you for the panelists.